It was a quiet neighborhood, one of those places where time seemed to slow down. Every evening, Emily Carter walked past the small house at the end of the street, and every evening, Mrs. Holloway was there, watering her plants. She had lived there for as long as Emily could remember, her frail hands carefully tending to her garden. But that evening, something was different. As Emily passed by, she smiled and waved, just as she always did. But this time, Mrs. Holloway hesitated before returning the gesture. Her eyes lingered on Emily for too long. And then, in a hushed voice, she said,
"I think someone's been inside my house, watching me."
The next morning, Emily noticed something odd. Mrs. Holloway's curtains, always open, were now drawn tight. Her front door hung slightly ajar. A single breath of cold air drifted from the darkness inside. Emily hesitated. Something about the silence felt wrong. Peering through the window, she saw chaos. Overturned furniture, papers scattered on the floor, and a single teacup perfectly placed in the center of the table, as if someone had been sitting there just moments ago. Someone or something was still in there. Emily returned home. She was scared. That night, Emily called the landlord. She needed answers.
"Mrs. Holloway, that house has been vacant for months. I have the lease right here. No one's lived there for years."
Emily's hands trembled as she pulled out her phone. There, on the screen, was a photo she had taken of Mrs. Holloway's garden just the day before. But something was wrong. The garden was there, the flowers, the old wooden fence, but Mrs. Holloway, gone, as if she had never existed at all. That night, sleep refused to come. Emily lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. And then, she heard it. A presence, a feeling, a cold, crawling dread creeping up her spine. Slowly, she turned her head and looked out the window. A figure stood at Mrs. Holloway's front door. It was dark, wrong. Its shape seemed to shift, fading in and out of sight. And then, it moved. The whisper comes in, layered with an echo.
"Help me, I'm still here."
Emily's breath hitched. The figure turned its head, and for the first time, she saw its face. It wasn't Mrs. Holloway. By morning, Emily rushed outside, but the house, Mrs. Holloway's house, was gone. Where there had once been a home, now stood an empty lot, overgrown with weeds, untouched by time. There were no signs of a house ever being there. No garden, no fence, nothing but dirt and silence. Emily's breath shakes. A paper rustles in her hands. Desperate for answers, she searched through old records, and finally, she found it. A newspaper clipping, decades old. The headline read, "Local woman Agnes Holloway, missing since 1989, last seen watering her plants." The paper crinkles, and Emily's heartbeat intensifies. And beneath the headline, a photo. It was her, Mrs. Holloway, the woman Emily had spoken to just days ago, the woman who had been watering her plants.
"Help me, I'm still here."
To this day, Emily swears, if you walk past that empty lot at just the right time, you can still see her, a frail, shadowy figure, watering her plants, waiting to be seen.